January 1944. The camp infirmary, known in the cynical language of the SS as the Revier, in the very heart of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The air here was not merely a gaseous mixture for breathing. It was a tangible, dense, and viscous substance, saturated with miasma, woven from the smells of cheap carbolic acid trying in vain to overpower the sweetish stench of pus and decaying flesh, the odors of unwashed, emaciated bodies, and that particular nauseating aroma exuded by concentrated hopelessness itself. Dr. Adam Nowak, number 174,508, stood by a murky window covered in a thick layer of icy frost, his gaze fixed on the gray, indifferent snow that fell slowly, almost reluctantly, onto the frozen black earth of the camp. Behind him, in the long, endless, dimly lit barrack, on rickety three-tiered bunks, lay those whom the soulless system had already written off, condemned. They were still breathing, their chests rising and falling almost imperceptibly, some emitting quiet moans like the creaking of wood. But their names had already been neatly crossed out from the lists of the living in the ledgers of the camp. Chancellery. Adam felt the piercing cold seep not only through his threadbare striped uniform, but much deeper, into his very bones, freezing something in the core of his soul, something that had once been alive and warm. He was a doctor, an epidemiologist with a European reputation, whose lectures on the theory of infection transmission once filled buzzing auditoriums at Warsaw University. Now, his only audience were these living shadows, these walking skeletons draped in gray skin, and his only lecture was the silent daily observation of how methodically, efficiently, and mercilessly the gigantic machine of death operated. That morning, at the risk of a beating, he had glanced over Clark's shoulder and seen the lists. Fresh lists for selection for barrack number 17, which housed workers from the nearby Bunawerke factory, utterly exhausted by labor. 357 names, 357 souls, 357 universes, which in a few days, maybe a week, were to become thick black smoke, rising into the low, leaden Polish sky. He had seen it dozens of times, hundreds. He had learned, forced himself to learn, to shut off his emotions, to build a wall of ice around his consciousness, to turn his heart into an inert stone, just to keep functioning, to not go insane from this endless conveyor belt of horror. But today, something broke. Something had cracked in that internal glacier. Perhaps it was the little 10-year-old girl with enormous frightened eyes the color of cornflowers, whom he had spent 2 weeks pulling back from the brink, fighting her dysentery, nursing her with an oak bark decoction secretly prepared by sisters. Hannah, her name was on the list. Or maybe it was the old music professor from the Vienna Conservatory who, even here, on the verge of starvation, when he thought no one could hear him, would quietly hum Chopin's melodies under his breath, his fingers moving across the filthy blanket, as if over the keys of a grand piano. His name was there too, next to the girl's. Adam Nowak, a man of science, a man of strict logic, suddenly realized with a blinding, chilling clarity the absolute, all-consuming irrationality and absurdity of what was happening. They weren't healing. They were merely postponing the inevitable, serving as a kind of filter for the crematorium, calibrating the material, sorting those who could still haul stones for a few more months from those who were already just biological waste, subject to disposal. And in that very moment, watching the silently falling snow cover everything in a shroud of indifferent purity, he made a decision. A decision as cold as a surgical instrument, mathematically precise, and utterly, shiveringly, insane. He would face this machine. He would not fight it with force. He had no force, save for the power of his intellect. He would fight it with its own favorite weapons: order, system, the fear of chaos, and bureaucracy. He would challenge hell not with a weapon in his hands, but with the knowledge in his head. He would deceive death, make it believe in an illusion, a phantom. In his inflamed but clearer than ever mind, amidst the hum of others' pain and his own despair, an idea began to form rapidly. so audacious and monstrous in its twisted logic that it could only have been born here, in the very heart of organized darkness, the idea of a fake, man-made epidemic. But to understand how a respected Warsaw professor, a man who had dedicated his entire life to saving people from disease, arrived at the thought of deliberately infecting them, even with a harmless infection, one must go back 2 agonizingly long years to that hot August day when his own orderly world, full of books, scientific debates, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, collapsed forever, turning to bitter ash and acrid smoke. Dr. Adam Nowak remembered his office in the old building of Warsaw University down to the smallest, almost tactile detail. He could close his eyes and feel the warm sunlight filtering through the tall, pointed Gothic window, slowly crawling across his desk, playing on the worn gold embossing of the hundreds of book spines that lined the massive oak shelves from floor to ceiling. The air in the office had a very particular scent: old, high-quality paper, the leather of ancient bindings, and the faint, cozy aroma of cherry tobacco from his favorite pipe. This was his world, his fortress. A world of absolute order, flawless logic, and triumphant reason. A world where any disease, any epidemic, was an enemy that could and must be studied, dissected, its weak points understood, and ultimately defeated. His enemies were cholera vibrios and cox bacilli, invisible but subject to the strict laws of nature. He tracked them as an experienced hunter tracks a beast, creating detailed maps of their spread, developing serums and vaccines that were his precise, calibrated bullets. In that pre-war world, he was a general in a pristine white coat, leading his silent army in an endless battle for human life. His wife, Anna, a talented artist with eyes the color of the summer sky and a perpetual smile on her lips, often joked that he saw the world exclusively through the magnifying lens of a microscope, noticing only what could be measured, classified, and explained. She would laugh her infectious laugh and say that he surely tried to break down even their love into biochemical reactions and hormonal surges. And he, kissing her paint-stained hands, would reply that love was the one epidemic for which he would never seek a cure. They had a daughter, 7-year-old Sophia, a little ray of sunshine with a shock of golden hair, who loved to sit on his lap while he worked and draw her own funny, colorful microbees in his thick scientific notebooks. Ones her papa would surely defeat. That was life. A real, full, vibrant, warm, and inexpressibly happy life. He remembered the last peaceful evening before the war began. They were sitting on the veranda of their country house near Warsaw drinking tart red wine, and Anna was reading poems by Julian Tuim aloud in a quiet voice. The air was thick, filled with the sweet scent of blooming phlox and the ozone freshness of an approaching thunderstorm. In the distance, on the horizon, silent heat lightning was already flashing. And Adam thought then how beautiful and unsettling it was at the same time, how the fragile tranquility of nature met its untamed power. He didn't know then that those distant flashes were but a faint, innocent reflection of the all-consuming fire that would soon engulf all of Europe, his entire world, his entire life, leaving behind only scorched earth. He remembered the first days of the occupation when the familiar sounds of the city, the clang of streetcars and children's laughter, were replaced by the heavy clatter of tank treads and the sharp, barking, guttural German speech. He remembered the humiliation when the brass plaque with his name was torn from the door of his university department, replaced by a crude German one. He remembered how they were herded like cattle into the ghetto, and his beautiful, vast world, the size of a whole universe, shrank to a few filthy, overcrowded streets teeming with despair. But even there, in the unimaginable hell of the Warsaw ghetto, he did not stop being a doctor. He organized an underground hospital in a damp basement, treated people for the typhus that was felling them by the hundreds, delivered babies by the light of a dim kerosene lamp, and performed complex surgeries with almost no instruments. He was still waging war against his old, understandable enemies, bacteria and viruses. He still naively believed that his main enemy was disease. How cruelly mistaken he was. His real enemy wore a perfectly pressed green uniform, spoke the language of Goethe and Schiller, and possessed a monstrous, inhuman industrial logic. He was arrested in August of 42, not for the underground hospital, not for helping the resistance, but simply because it was his turn, because his name appeared on another list, printed on cheap paper. On that cold day, despite it being August, he saw Anna and Sophia for the last time. He remembered their beloved faces behind the barbed wire of the transit point, remembered how Sophia's small hand waved desperately to him until she was obscured by the backs of other condemned people, marching into the unknown. He didn't know then that their transport was headed for Treblinka. He would learn that much later, here in Auschwitz, from a snippet of a random conversation overheard in the infirmary. And the moment that knowledge pierced him, something inside him would die completely, irrevocably. His heart would not turn to stone. No. It would become a scorched, lifeless desert where only a single feeling remained, cold, pure, and sharp as a scalpel's edge. Hatred. But it would not be a blind, incinerating rage, but the cold, analytical, calculating hatred of a scientist. He would study his new primary enemy, the system of total annihilation, as meticulously and dispassionately as he had once studied the life cycle of the cholera vibrio under a microscope. He would understand its logic, its internal mechanisms, its weaknesses, its panicked fears. On that distant, peaceful evening in his office, on the eve of the invasion, he was, as usual, writing another chapter of his monograph on quarantine measures during epidemics, never suspecting that the sound he would hear a few days later would not be the tapping of the first drops of a thunderstorm against his window, but the heavy, measured tread of soldiers' boots coming to arrest and destroy his entire world. A deafening crash. A piercing screech of metal on metal that set one's teeth on edge. Inhuman screams where pain, terror, and despair mingled with the furious, choked barking of German shepherds and sharp, guttural commands in German. It was a sound you didn't just hear. It seeped under your skin and burned itself into your memory forever. The cattle car, where they had been packed like sardines in a tin for 3 days without a drop of water or a crumb of food, finally shuddered and stopped. The heavy doors slid open with a deafening shriek, and a blinding, merciless glare of floodlights burst into the stuffy, foul-smelling darkness that reeked of excrement, sweat, and animal fear. Adam Nowak, like dozens of other tormented people, squeezed his eyes shut, instinctively covering his face with his hands, trying to adjust to this light that seemed hostile, sharp, and lifeless. They were pushed out, thrown onto the concrete platform with rifle butts. It was night, but the bright floodlights made it feel like some grotesque, distorted, theatrical day. The air was freezing and smelled of smoke. A strange, unfamiliar, cloyingly sweet smoke he had never inhaled before. He raised his head and saw high fences of barbed wire stretching into the darkness, strung on concrete posts with white porcelain insulators. He saw watchtowers with the silhouettes of machine gunners and endless straight rows of identical wooden barracks disappearing into the impenetrable gloom. This was not just a camp. It was another planet, a monstrous world that lived by its own inhuman laws. They were roughly herded into columns, men separately, women and children separately. Adam desperately searched the heaving crowd for familiar faces, but saw only masks distorted by terror, expressing nothing. Before them, on a small platform, stood SS officers in perfectly pressed black and green uniforms, with silver death's heads on their caps. They looked completely calm, even a little bored, as if this were the most ordinary routine work. One of them, a tall, elegant SS doctor with fine aristocratic features and a delicate writing crop in his hand, began what was called selection here. With a casual, lazy flick of his crop, he pointed who should go right and who should go left. To the right was a column of relatively strong men and young women, those who could still work. To the left, the elderly, children, the sick, all those deemed useless ballast at first glance. None of the new arrivals yet fully understood what this simple division meant, but an instinctive, animal fear, deep in their souls, told them that the road to the left was a one-way street. When Adam's turn came, the officer's cold, appraising gaze lingered on him for a moment. "Profession?" he asked in flawless, unaccented Polish. "Doctor, epidemiologist," Adam replied, using all his strength to keep his voice from trembling. The officer smirked, a corner of his mouth twisting almost imperceptibly. "A doctor? Good. We have a great need for doctors here. To the right." That short, mundane exchange saved his life, but it also condemned him to something worse than a quick, merciful death. It condemned him to be a daily, hourly witness, an unwilling cog in this infernal machine. He was led through the gates with the cynical, mocking inscription forged upon them. "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. His head was shaved, all his clothes were taken, he was hosed down with ice-cold water, and then a number was tattooed on. His left arm, 174,508. In that moment, Dr. Adam Nowak, professor at Warsaw University, husband of Anna and father of Sophia, ceased to exist. Only the number remained, a nameless, faceless accounting unit in the camp's statistics. The first few minutes after arrival were a deafening, paralyzing shock. The realization that he was trapped, that his identity was erased, that he no longer belonged to himself came slowly, in waves of icy, clammy horror. He saw the column of those sent to the left, including women and children, being led towards large, low-slung buildings with tall brick chimneys from which the same cloying, nauseating smoke billowed. He didn't know for sure what it was yet, but he already suspected, and that knowledge was heavier than any physical suffering. In the barrack where he was assigned, semi-darkness and an unbearable stench reigned. People who looked like shadows, like living corpses, stared at him with empty, burnt-out eyes. These were the old-timers, the camp veterans. They already knew everything. They were the living dead, and in their dead gazes, Adam saw his own reflection, his own inevitable future. That first, endless night, he lay on the hard, bare bunks, listening to the groans, wheezes, and coughs around him, and tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. God seemed out of place here, impossible, absurd. There was no God here. There was only the number on his arm and the greasy black smoke from the crematorium chimneys. He looked at his calloused doctor's hands, hands that had saved hundreds of lives. And in that moment, he understood. If he wanted to survive, he had to become a useful, indispensable tool for this system. He had to make them believe he was needed alive. The first weeks in the camp were like one endless, nightmarish gray day, blurring into a viscous mass of piercing cold, agonizing hunger, exhausting, meaningless labor, and constant animal, humiliating fear. Adam, like thousands of other prisoners, was forced to work on construction. He carried heavy, ice-covered stones, mixed freezing cement with his bare hands, and dug earth that was as hard as rock. His hands, accustomed to sterile surgical gloves and fine instruments, turned into a bloody mess, covered in festering calluses. His body, used to the comfort of a professor's chair and a soft bed, became a single aching, groaning bundle of pain. Hunger was his constant, relentless companion. It wasn't just an emptiness in his stomach, like in civilian life. It was a dull, gnawing, maddening pain that shut down all thought, forcing him to think of only one thing: an extra crumb of bread, an extra spoonful of the watery, warm turnip swill they mockingly called soup. He saw with his own eyes how people who were once professors, musicians, poets, transformed before him into beasts, ready to kill a comrade for a potato peel found in the mud. He saw them rapidly lose their human form, saw everything, intelligence, kindness, dignity, vanish from their eyes, leaving only one thing: the primal, ferocious will to survive at any cost. What saved Adam was that he was a doctor. After several excruciating weeks, his number was called out at evening roll call. He was transferred to work in the Revier, the camp infirmary. At first, it seemed like an unbelievable salvation, a miracle. A roof over his head, no grueling physical labor, relative warmth, and most importantly, an extra ration of bread. But he soon realized he had moved from one circle of hell to another, even more sophisticated and monstrous. The Revier was not a place of healing. It was the antechamber to the crematorium, the sorting department of the death machine. There were practically no medicines, no proper bandages, not even basic antiseptics. All they had were rolls of paper bandages that disintegrated at the slightest moisture, a little aspirin, and a few scalpels they secretly sharpened on stones. Here, they didn't treat diseases. They merely classified and registered them. Adam and the other prisoner doctors had to keep meticulous, pedantic records. Every morning they made rounds through the barracks, examining hundreds of sick people, making diagnoses, and entering them in neat handwriting into thick ledgers. And once a week, he would come to the Revier, the camp doctor, SS Hauptsturmführer Dietrich Richter. Richter was the complete opposite of the stereotypical sadistic SS officer. He was highly educated, fluent in several European languages, quoted Nietzsche, appreciated classical music, and was always impeccably shaven, smelling of expensive cologne. He never shouted, never beat prisoners. He did his job with the cold, detached scientific efficiency of a research scientist. He would slowly review the ledgers that Adam and his colleagues kept, and with his calligraphic handwriting he would place a small, neat red cross next to certain names. Typhus? A cross? Severe dysentery? A cross? Extreme emaciation, the so-called Musulman stage, inability to work? A cross? The people marked with red crosses were sent to the gas chamber that same day. This was selection. Adam realized with horror that they, the prisoner doctors, had unwittingly become a crucial part of this system. With their diagnoses, their precise entries in the ledgers, they were signing death warrants for their comrades in misfortune with their own hands. This realization was more terrifying than hunger, cold, or beatings. It ate away at his soul like concentrated acid. One day, he witnessed a particularly large-scale selection. A transport of emaciated women from another camp was brought to the barrack. Richter personally conducted the inspection. He walked slowly along the bunks, lazily glancing at the gaunt, naked bodies, and casually pointed with his riding crop who was to live and who was to die. It was done so casually, so routinely, so mundanely, as if he were culling livestock at a slaughterhouse. That day, Adam saw more than 200 women led out of the barrack. He saw their eyes. There was no longer any fear or hope in them, only a gray, bottomless emptiness. That image was forever seared into his memory like a brand. He understood that passive survival, trying to simply wait out this nightmare, to lie low, to be inconspicuous, was a sure path to nowhere. There was no hope of imminent rescue. The system worked flawlessly, like a well-oiled clock, and if you became unfit in its eyes, you were doomed. It was then, on one of those cold, damp January days, when a capo brought the lists for the next selection for barrack number 17, which housed hundreds of weakened workers, that Adam knew he had to, was obligated to, do something. He could no longer be a passive registrar of death. An idea, insane, risky, suicidal, began to take a clear, terrifying shape. He looked at a form with the diagnosis typhus and thought about what the Germans, these supermen, feared most in the world. They didn't fear the prisoners' deaths. That was the goal of their work. They didn't fear suffering. That was their tool. But they had a panicked, irrational fear of one thing: uncontrolled epidemics. An epidemic that could spread to them, to the guards, to the camp administration. Typhus was their personal nightmare. Any SS man who developed a fever was immediately isolated and sent to the best hospital. The camp could be put under total quarantine, disrupting all production plans. And it was this fear, this single panicked fear of their masters, that Adam decided to turn into his weapon. Their meager medical supplies were running out. All they could do was watch the agony of several hundred more people. It seemed all was lost. But it was then, looking into the empty, fading eyes of a young man dying of starvation, that Adam spoke the words that were both salvation and absolute madness. We need an epidemic. A real one. Or at least, one that looks very, very real. The idea was so monstrous, so contrary to everything he had been taught, to everything he believed, that upon saying it aloud, Adam himself was frightened by the sound of his own words. To intentionally induce symptoms of a deadly disease in weakened, tormented people, even if fake, here in Auschwitz, where any scratch could lead to death, where a human life was worth absolutely nothing. It was beyond the pale of medical ethics, beyond human comprehension. But the Hippocratic Oath, etched in golden letters in his mind, sounded here, in this inverted looking-glass world, like a cruel, mocking joke. Do no harm. How could one not do harm when one's very inaction, one's passivity, one's adherence to the rules was direct complicity in mass murder? The first person he dared to share his insane plan with was Sister Hannah. Hannah Kowalska was an elderly but surprisingly energetic nurse from Krakow. She'd been working in the Revier for almost a year and had seen everything one could possibly see in this hell. She was a thin, almost transparent woman with deep-set dark eyes that seemed to reflect all the suffering of this cursed place. But somewhere in the depths of those eyes, a flame of unyielding, stubborn will still flickered. She was what the camp respectfully called an organizer. She knew all the kapos, knew who to give a stolen cigarette to in order to get an extra ampule of morphine for a dying man, knew which barrack might have a few clean rags or even a potato. She was the quiet, invisible center of their small, fragile world of survival. Adam found her in the tiny, cluttered storeroom where they kept their meager medicines. He spoke in a whisper, almost soundlessly, constantly glancing at the door. He laid it all out for her, holding nothing back. To create an artificial controlled outbreak of disease in barrack number 17, with symptoms practically indistinguishable from typhus. High fever, a characteristic roseola rash on the body, general weakness, and intoxication. To do this to several dozen prisoners to create the illusion of a rapidly spreading epidemic for the camp administration. To make Richter and his superiors believe that conducting a selection in that barrack now would be pure suicide, that the entire barrack must be immediately isolated under the strictest quarantine. To buy time. Precious weeks, maybe even months. And in that time, anything could happen. A rebellion could start, the front line, which was rumored to be relentlessly approaching from the east, could break through. Hannah listened to him in silence, not interrupting with a single word. Her wrinkled face was as inscrutable as an ancient mask. When Adam finished, she was silent for a long time, staring at a single point with unseeing eyes. Then she slowly turned her tired, heavy gaze to him. "You've gone mad, Pan Doctor," she whispered so quietly he could barely hear. "Do you have any idea what you're proposing? We'll have to cripple our own people with our own hands. And what if Richter, that devil in a white coat, suspects a trick? They'll hang us all on the Appellplatz as a deterrent, and the ones we tried to save will be killed twice as fast and twice as painfully." Adam had expected this reaction. He had been through all these doubts himself. They gnawed at him from the inside. "Hannah," he said just as quietly but with immense inner strength, "what other choice do we have? To stand by and silently watch as they are led like cattle to the gas chamber? Without this deception, they have zero chance of survival. Zero. With my plan, there's at least one chance in 1,000. I'm not asking you to believe in success. I'm asking you to help me take this one ghostly chance." He saw something flicker in her eyes. She'd seen too much death to cling to empty, false hopes. But she was also a woman of action, not passive waiting. She knew it was better to die trying to do something than to meekly wait her turn in the endless camp line for death. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Once, short and sharp. It was their pact, sealed not with words, but with shared despair and a shared, all-consuming hatred for this place. It was their first, tiny, but so very important victory. He had his first ally. Now they needed to find the tools for their unthinkable biological weapon. What could induce a fever? What could create a believable rash? They had nothing but their own knowledge. But Adam was a scientist. His mind, accustomed to solving the most complex problems, began to work with a feverish, almost painful speed. Fever. They needed a weak, non-lethal bacterial culture, something that could cause a sharp spike in temperature but not kill a weakened organism. He remembered the so-called rabbit breeder's disease, or tularemia. In a weakened form, it produced the right symptoms: high fever, headache, weakness, and rarely led to a fatal outcome. But where could they get it in a concentration camp? And the rash. They needed a strong skin reaction, something that would cause local redness and small blisters resembling typhus roseoli. He began to frantically rack his brain, thinking of everything that grew on the campgrounds, all the weeds, all the grasses, and suddenly he remembered. He remembered the giant thickets of Heracleum sosnowski, or giant hogweed, a poisonous plant the Germans had once tried to cultivate as silage. Its sap, when it came into contact with skin, caused severe chemical burns and blisters, especially under sunlight. It grew in abundance behind the barracks near a drainage ditch. Their weapon was everywhere, right under their feet. They just needed to know how to find it and use it. But so far they had only conquered each other's doubts. The real mortally dangerous battle, a battle against the indifferent nature of this hell and the diabolical cunning of their enemies, was still ahead. With his first and most reliable ally behind him, Adam began to act with the cold, detached determination of a surgeon embarking on a complex, hours-long operation. The next step was to form a small, completely sealed team. He couldn't do this alone with Hannah. He needed other doctors, men he could trust with his life and theirs, men with specialized knowledge and, most importantly, a desperation stronger than the instinctual fear of death. His choice fell on two men. The first was Emil Fischer, a brilliant, world-renowned surgeon from Prague, a caustic cynic and a staunch skeptic who had lost his entire family in the Theresienstadt camp. Emil was a man of irrefutable facts and cold logic. He didn't believe in miracles and thought the only meaningful task in the camp was to survive one more day, until the next morning's roll call. He despised any display of heroism, considering it foolish, sentimental nonsense that led to a swift and pointless death. Adam knew that convincing Fischer would be the hardest part, but his surgical precision, steady hand, and knowledge of anatomy were vital. The second was Leo Grossman, a very young man, a 20-year-old biochemistry student from Łódź. Leo was a true genius. Even here, in the inhuman conditions of the camp, he managed to conduct his own experiments, mixing herbal decoctions in tin cans, trying to create a cure for the scurvy that was felling the prisoners. He was quiet, shy, almost invisible, but his mind was a veritable walking encyclopedia. Adam needed him for the most delicate, painstaking part of the plan, creating, weakening, and correctly dosing the vaccine that would cause the fever. The historic conversation took place late one night in the morgue, the only place in the entire Riviera where they could speak without fear of being overheard by informers. The dead were the most reliable keepers of secrets. By the light of a single dim, sputtering lamp surrounded by bodies covered with dirty sheets, Adam, stumbling over his words with anxiety, laid out his plan. Fischer's reaction was predictable and devastating. He laughed, a quiet, joyless, bone-chilling laugh. "Novak, you finally lost your mind," he said, wiping away unsolicited tears. "Simulate an epidemic? Do you have any idea how many unknown variables are in your insane equation? One wrong step, one tiny mistake in the dosage, and we won't have a fake epidemic, but a real, uncontrolled outbreak of tularemia that will kill them all before the Germans do. Or more likely, Richter, that Bach aficionado, will see through your cheap provincial theater in the first minute. He's not an idiot, Novak. He'll see the clinical picture doesn't match the classic one. And then he won't just send us to the gas chamber. He'll torture us for weeks, slowly, with pleasure, to find out who else was involved. You're putting not only yourself at risk, but all of us, you idiot." Adam listened to the furious tirade in silence without interrupting. He understood every word Fischer said. The risks were colossal, almost 100%. "You're right about everything, Emil," he answered calmly, almost without emotion. "The risks are enormous. But what is the risk for those 357 people in Barrack 17? Their risk is 100%. I'm offering them a chance. 1 in 1,000. And us too. A chance to die not like silent cattle, but like men who tried to fight back. Isn't that worth the risk?" Leo, who had been silent until then, huddled in a corner, suddenly raised his enormous, feverishly bright eyes. "It's possible," he whispered, and his whisper sounded deafeningly loud in the dead silence. "Theoretically, it's possible. The Francisella tularensis culture can be attenuated through repeated passage. If we can get a sample. I heard there were cases of tularemia in the camp among those who worked in the food warehouses. We need a blood or tissue sample from someone who died. And for the rash, the hogweed sap is brilliant, Pan Doctor. It contains furanocoumarins, which cause acute photodermatitis. The symptoms will look very similar to typhus roseoli. The key is the right concentration and precise application." Fisher looked at Leo as if he were another madman. But Adam saw a flicker of professional interest in his tired, cynical eyes. The interest of a surgeon who had been offered an impossible, yet incredibly beautiful, in its madness, problem to solve. Their small group was formed. The most dangerous phase began, gathering the ingredients for their diabolical potion. Hannah, using her priceless connections, managed to get a tiny tissue sample from a prisoner who had died of an unknown fever from a capo working in the pathology department in exchange for her week's bread ration. There was a high probability it was tularemia. At night, Leo, in his makeshift laboratory in the darkest corner of the morgue, began his sorcery. He used broken test tubes, homemade cloth filters, and an alcohol burner made from a tin can and a bandage wick. It was the true alchemy of despair. He spent hours working on the sample, trying to isolate and weaken the deadly culture. Fisher, grumbling and cursing everything under the sun, secretly smuggled stolen, blunted syringe needles and scalpel fragments out of the operating room. Adam and Hannah, at night, risking being shot on sight, crawled to the drainage ditch, cutting the thick stems of hogweed and collecting its caustic, dangerous sap in empty medicine vials. They were creating their own empire out of nothing. Their laws were absolute conspiracy and silence. Their economy was the risky exchange of stolen goods for necessities. Their production was the creation of weapons from trash, filth, and poison. Every day was a mortal risk. Every suspicious glance from a guard, every unexpected question from a capo could be their last. But as their diabolical arsenal grew, a strange, dark, cold confidence grew within them. They were no longer passive victims. They were conspirators. They were creating their own small secret system within the great system of death. And this system gave them not only a ghostly chance to save others, but also something that had been almost lost forever, a reason to exist. But their growing organization and secret nightly excursions could not go unnoticed forever in this world teeming with informants. There were always eyes and ears in the barracks. And one night, as Adam was returning from the ditch, clutching the precious vial of sap to his chest, he came face to face with Yannick, one of the most notorious camp snitches. Their eyes met in the dim, ghostly moonlight. And in that moment, Adam knew that their plan was on the brink of complete, catastrophic failure. The conflicts Adam feared most came not from the outside, from guards or informants, but from within their small, tight-knit group. Emil Fisher, their most valuable specialist and simultaneously their most ardent skeptic, was becoming increasingly nervous, edgy, and uncontrollable. He saw their terrible work progressing, saw young Leo with burning, crazed eyes reporting the successful weakening of the bacterial culture to the required concentration, saw Hannah biting her lip, compiling preliminary lists of candidates for infection from barrack number 17. And the more real, the more tangible their plan became, the stronger his animal fear grew. One night, he exploded. He cornered Adam in the morgue, pressing him against the cold, damp wall, his whisper full of restrained fury and deep despair. "Do you realize what we're doing, Novak? We're preparing to play God, a real, actual God. Have you already decided who we're going to save? Who we're going to infect? And who we're going to leave to rot? The old? The children? The weaker ones? And who gave you that right? Who are you to decide? Tell me, how are we any better than that bastard Richter, who does the exact same thing with his riding crop, deciding who lives and who turns to smoke? You're turning us into monsters just like them, do you hear me? It was a blow to the heart, to the most vulnerable point of his conscience. Adam had asked himself these cursed questions every sleepless, nightmarish night. The monstrosity of the choice they had to make weighed on him like an unbearable physical burden. Who to choose? How to explain to someone that you must cause them pain, expose them to risk, in order to save their life? How to look into the eyes of those you don't choose, those you essentially condemn to death by your inaction? But he could not, did not have the right to show weakness. Not now. He looked directly into Fisher's eyes, inflamed from lack of sleep. His voice was cold and hard as steel. Right? We have no rights, Emil. We only have a choice, and it's terrifyingly simple. Either we do nothing and all 357 people in Barrack 17 will die, guaranteed, with 100% certainty. Or we try to save at least some of them, dirtying our hands and taking a sin upon our souls that we will never be able to atone for. I've made my choice. And you? You can walk away right now. No one will judge you. But then you'll have to live with the thought that you could have done something, but you got scared and washed your hands of it. He employed what he would later, in his thoughts, call surgical cruelty. He did not console, did not persuade, did not convince. He presented Fisher with a fact, with the same bottomless abyss of moral choice that he himself stared into every second. Fisher staggered back as if from a physical blow. He wanted to shout something in response, to object, but the words stuck in his throat. He saw in Adam's eyes not the fanaticism of a madman, but the cold, endless torment of a man who had voluntarily shouldered an impossible burden. And he broke, or rather, he found a new, terrible strength. He slowly lowered his head. "All right," he rasped. "I'm with you. But if we get caught, I'll say it was all my idea." The mutiny was quashed. Their small group was once again a single, monolithic whole, cemented by shared risk and a shared, albeit terrible, inhuman goal. They made the lists. They chose 50 of the strongest and most resilient men from Barrack 17. Those who had the best chance of enduring the artificial illness without serious, irreversible consequences. The most dreadful, most difficult part of their operation began. The conversations with these men. Adam, Hannah, and Emil, one by one, under the cover of night, summoned them to the infirmary under the pretext of an urgent medical examination. In the dark storeroom, by the light of a candle stub, they whispered their insane plan. The reactions varied. Some began to cry in terror and helplessness. Some looked on with open disbelief, suspecting an elaborate SS provocation. But most, seeing not deceit but desperate final resolve in the doctor's eyes, silently agreed. They had nothing but their almost worthless lives, and they were willing to stake them for one ghostly chance. But while they were dealing with their inner demons and convincing the doomed to voluntarily accept suffering, they failed to notice their real external enemy make his move. The snitch, Yannick, who had seen Adam by the ditch, reported it to the proper authorities. One afternoon, while Adam was in the barrack helping a sick man, the door was thrown open with a crash, and 2 SS guards from the camp security appeared in the doorway. "Prisoner 174,508 outside, with your things. Hauptsturmführer Richter wants to have a word with you." Adam's heart plummeted into an icy abyss. This was the end. Failure, torture, and a painful death awaited them all. Hauptsturmführer Dietrich Richter's office was an oasis of civilization and order in the midst of all-consuming hell and chaos. A perfectly polished desk of dark, almost black wood, a comfortable leather armchair, and on the walls in austere frames, antique engravings of anatomical drawings. On the desk sat a gramophone with a gleaming brass horn, from which flowed the quiet, melancholic, and infinitely beautiful music of Bach. The air in the office smelled of good pipe tobacco and expensive citrus cologne. Richter sat at his desk, casually leafing through some papers in a folder. He didn't even look up when two guards roughly pushed Adam into the office. For several agonizingly long minutes, he made him stand in silence in the middle of the room, savoring his absolute power. This deafening, tense silence, broken only by Bach's music, was more terrifying than any screams or torture. Finally, he slowly raised his eyes. His gaze was cold, colorless, and probing, like that of an entomologist examining a rare but uninteresting insect under a magnifying glass. "Dr. Nowak," he said in perfect academic German, "please, have a seat." He pointed to a simple wooden chair in front of the desk. This was unheard of. A prisoner being offered a seat in an SS officer's office. Adam instantly understood that this was the beginning of some sophisticated, diabolical psychological game. He sat, trying to maintain an outward calm, though his heart was pounding furiously in his chest, echoing in his ears. "I have been reading your pre-war work," Richter continued, slowly packing his pipe. "Epidemiological models of infection transmission. Quite impressive. A very profound analysis. You are, without a doubt, a talented scientist, Nowak. What a pity you were born on the wrong side." He paused, lighting his pipe and releasing a ring of fragrant smoke into the air. "I have been informed that you've recently been showing an unhealthy, I would even say, scientific interest in the camp's flora, specifically in a plant of the species Heracleum, hogweed, if I'm not mistaken, a highly poisonous and dangerous plant. Could you perhaps explain to an old physician like myself why a distinguished epidemiologist would need common hogweed? Have you decided to change your specialty to botany?" Adam felt an icy chill run down his spine. He knew. He knew everything. Any attempt at denial was pointless and foolish. He had to play the game, the most dangerous, most important game of his life. He decided to go all in. "Herr Hauptsturmführer," he began, trying to keep his voice even, calm, and respectful. "As an epidemiologist, I cannot help but notice extremely alarming signs. The overcrowding, the unsanitary conditions, the widespread exhaustion of the organisms. Our camp is, forgive me, a perfect petri dish for the emergence of any epidemic, particularly typhus. And hogweed, its sap, as is well known, causes skin reactions that in some cases could be mistaken for the early symptoms of typhus, a roseola rash. I was studying it to create a manual for our orderlies, to teach them how to distinguish false symptoms from real ones, to avoid panic and unnecessary premature quarantine measures. It was a brazen, monstrous, but very plausible lie, cloaked in the language of scientific logic that Richter would understand and appreciate. He was playing on his field, speaking his language, appealing to his professionalism. Richter stared at him for a long time without blinking, and Adam could physically feel his sharp, analytical mind weighing every word, searching for the slightest trick, the slightest inconsistency. "An interesting theory," he finally said with a faint smile. "Commendable foresight, Doctor. But I have other information as well. In barrack number 17, which, as you are well aware, is being prepared for a scheduled sanitization, there has been a strange, inexplicable spike in feverish conditions. 50 cases in the last 2 days. And all of them, imagine, have some sort of strange rash on their bodies. What an amazing coincidence, wouldn't you agree, Dr. Nowak?" It was checkmate. He had them. Adam realized they had started their operation too late, or Richter was far more perceptive than he had thought. All that was left was to face death with dignity. But in that very moment, just as Adam was bracing for the worst, something unforeseen happened. A commotion was heard outside the door, hurried footsteps, and Richter's adjutant, pale as a sheet, burst into the office without knocking. Herr Hauptsturmführer, an inspection committee from Berlin has arrived unexpectedly, led by Standartenführer Krüger. They are already on the campgrounds. They are heading here to personally approve the selection lists. Richter's face changed instantly. An unscheduled inspection from Berlin was the worst thing that could happen. Any emergency, any violation of established order, any unforeseen situation could cost him his career, or even his head. He looked sharply at Adam, then at the door, and in his cold eyes Adam saw not malice, but cold, cynical, bureaucratic calculation. A full-blown typhus epidemic in the camp during a visit from a high-level commission from Berlin itself, that would be a personal catastrophe for him. Adam realized that fate had just dealt him one last most incredible, most fantastic trump card. Richter's panicked fear for his own skin. Herr Hauptsturmführer, Adam said quickly, enunciating each word as if striking with a small hammer. If the commission sees what is happening in Barrack 17 right now, they will lock down the entire camp under total quarantine. It will be an international scandal. But if you report to them that you personally identified an outbreak of a dangerous infection and have already taken all necessary preventive measures by isolating the entire barrack, you will appear in their eyes not as the culprit but as a hero who averted a disaster. Richter stared at him, and in his intelligent, cruel eyes, suspicion and cold pragmatism waged a desperate battle. He knew perfectly well that Adam was brazenly manipulating him. But he also knew that Adam's proposal was the only possible way to save himself. This was their duel with the abyss. An intellectual duel to the death, with hundreds of lives at stake. Without waiting for an invitation, 3 men entered the office. Standartenführer Krüger from Berlin, an elderly, heavy-set man with a puffy face and a weary, disdainful expression, and his 2 silent adjutants. They exuded the air of capital city authority, expensive tobacco, and fine perfume, which seemed sacrilegious and out of place here. Richter snapped to attention, his usual languor and aristocratic ease vanishing in an instant. Herr Standartenführer, welcome to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Your arrival is a great honor for us. The visitor from Berlin gave a curt nod, his cold gaze sliding over Adam as if he were a piece of furniture, and settled on Richter. Richter, we have very little time. We are here to inspect the general sanitary conditions and approve the lists for the scheduled disposal of unfit elements. I want to personally inspect the material prepared in barrack number 17. Adam's heart stopped, then skipped a beat. If they went to the barrack now, it would all be over. A single glance from any experienced doctor, and Krüger was known to have a medical background, would be enough to see that the rash was fake, caused by a chemical burn, and the fever had nothing to do with the classic picture of typhus. But Richter had already made his choice. He had bet everything. Herr Standartenführer, he said in a firm, confident, almost steely voice, I'm afraid that is absolutely impossible. Just an hour ago, my doctors identified an acute, fulminant outbreak of typhus in barrack 17. Over 50 cases with a classic clinical presentation. I have already given the order for the complete and immediate isolation of the entire barrack and the implementation of a strict quarantine. To enter there now would be to expose not only you, Herr Standartenführer, but the entire camp administration to mortal danger. A look of frank annoyance and poorly concealed, instinctive fear crossed Krüger's face. The word typhus had a magical effect on these men, paralyzing their will. Typhus? Are you certain, Richter? This is extremely unpleasant and untimely news. Absolutely certain, Richter lied without blinking. In fact, here is a prisoner doctor, Professor Nowak, one of Poland's best epidemiologists before the war, who can confirm my words. He personally conducted the initial diagnosis. All eyes, heavy and sharp, turned to Adam. This was the climax of their entire insane plan. One wrong word, one twitch of an eyelid, one drop of sweat on his brow, and everything would collapse into the abyss. He slowly stood up. Yes, Herr Standartenführer. The symptomatology leaves no room for doubt. A sharp rise in temperature to 40 degrees Celsius, 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, a characteristic roseola rash, and in some cases, delirium in the patients. Without an immediate and total quarantine, we risk a full-scale epidemic that would completely paralyze the work of the entire industrial complex for months. He spoke calmly, confidently, in an almost academic tone, using professional terms meant to convince not so much a doctor as a high-ranking official afraid of derailing his plans. And it worked. The Standartenführer grimaced in disgust. The prospect of being stuck in quarantine in Auschwitz for several weeks clearly did not appeal to him. "Very well, Richter," he ground out through his teeth. "I approve your actions. You've shown due diligence. Provide me with a full report on the measures taken by this evening. The selection in that damn barrack is postponed until the quarantine is fully lifted. In the meantime, show me the other facilities." They turned and left. Adam and Richter were alone in the office. The silence was broken only by the eternal divine music of Bach. Richter went to a cabinet, took out a bottle of French cognac and poured 2 glasses. He silently handed one to Adam. "You are a very good actor, Nowak, and a very, very audacious man. You've saved your people. For now." He drank his cognac in one large gulp. "But do not think for a moment that I am an idiot. I don't believe in such amazing coincidences. As of this minute, I am opening an official investigation. I will find proof of your sabotage. I will dismantle your little theater brick by brick, board by board, and when I do, I will personally see to it that your death is long and very, very painful. Now get out. You have a few weeks to enjoy your pathetic victory." The plan had worked. Barrack number 17 was saved. 357 people had received a reprieve from certain death. It was a victory. An incredible, unthinkable, fantastic victory of intellect over the soulless machine of death. But the price of this victory was terrifying. They were now under his personal, intense scrutiny. Richter would not forgive them this public humiliation. He would start interrogating the sick. He would bring in other doctors. He would look for traces of poison, for injection marks. The noose of the investigation would begin to tighten around them with each passing day, each passing hour. They had escaped the fire only to land right in the frying pan. Liberation came suddenly, swiftly, like a thunderstorm on a clear winter day. In late January of 1945, rumors swept through the camp like a madman's ravings, like feverish hallucinations. They said artillery fire could be clearly heard from the east. They said Russian tanks were already near Krakow, only a few dozen kilometers away. The camp administration pretended nothing was happening, but a thick electric tension hung in the air. The guards became meaner, more irritable, beating people for the slightest reason. Selections stopped. A poorly concealed panic began. The SS frantically burned archives in the chancellery stoves. Smoke billowed from the crematorium chimneys day and night. They were covering the tracks of their monstrous crimes. The investigation that Richter had started with such fury had hit a dead end. He interrogated several dozen of the recovered from Barrack 17, but no one broke. As if by agreement, they all insisted on a sudden, terrible fever and a painful rash, and even thanked the German doctors for saving them. Leo and Fisher had done their work flawlessly, with surgical precision. No traces of injections remained, and the symptoms had passed without any consequences, leaving only weakness. Richter was furious. He felt in his gut that he had been played for a fool, but he couldn't prove a thing. He simply ran out of time. On January 27, 1945, Soviet T-34 tanks, with infantry riding on their hulls, smashed through the camp gates with a roar. The SS had fled, managing to herd columns of still relatively healthy prisoners on the so-called death marches to the west. Those in the infirmaries and quarantine barracks were simply abandoned to their fate. Barrack number 17, still under formal quarantine, was left untouched. When the Soviet soldiers, young men shaken to their core by what they saw, opened the gates of the barrack, they found hundreds of emaciated, ghost-like people. They were weak. They were on the brink of starvation, but they were alive. All 357 of them. Adam, Hannah, Emil and Leo survived too. The euphoria of rescue was as brief as a flash of light. It was quickly replaced by a collision with the new, post-war reality. Their story of a fake epidemic sounded too incredible, too fantastic. Investigators from the Soviet and Allied commissions for Nazi war crimes listened to them with polite but frank disbelief. Where was the proof? Where were the documents? Where were the witnesses who could confirm a deliberate, artificial infection? The people from Barrack 17 confirmed they had been sick, but none of them could prove the illness was artificial. Dr. Adam Nowak's story was too good, too cinematic to be true. In the new, post-war world that desperately wanted order and justice, that was accustomed to protocols, documents, and irrefutable physical evidence, their feat, based on deceit, illusion, and the violation of every conceivable rule, had no legal value. It was dismissed as a fabrication, a camp tale, an attempt by a survivor to exaggerate his role in events. To the new system, they were just survivors, some among many. Their small, secret brotherhood, forged in the hell of the Riviera, fell apart. Fate scattered them to different corners of a ravaged post-war Europe. They had won their small, desperate war, but they lost in the clash with a larger, normal world, a world that did not want to believe in miracles, especially such dark, ambiguous, and conscience-troubling ones. The feat for which they had risked their lives every day was buried under tons of archival documents and official reports, in which there was simply no suitable category for it. After the liberation and several months in filtration camps, the heroes' paths diverged, like tracks in the thawing spring water. Emil Fischer, the famous Prague surgeon, returned to his native city. He found his house, but other people had been living in it for a long time. He learned that his entire large family, every last one, had perished. The cynicism that had been his reliable armor in the camp turned into a slow poison in peacetime, corrupting his soul. He tried to return to work. He operated. He saved lives. But as his colleagues said, he never smiled at anyone ever again. It was said that until the end of his days, he washed his hands 100 times a day, obsessively, as if trying to scrub off the invisible, ingrained filth of the camp and the unbearable weight of the choice they had once made. He died in complete solitude in the 60s, from a massive heart attack. The young genius, Leo Grossman, went to Palestine, and then to the newly created State of Israel. He became a world-renowned biochemist, received numerous awards, and worked at one of Tel Aviv's leading universities. But he never told anyone, not even his wife, about what he had done in his first, terrible laboratory in the Auschwitz morgue. His colleagues considered him brilliant but extremely withdrawn and a bit strange. He dedicated his entire life to creating vaccines and cures for the most terrible diseases, as if trying to atone for that single terrible sin when he used his genius not to heal, but to deceive. Sister Hanna Kowalska returned to a ruined but beloved Krakow. She worked as an ordinary nurse in the city hospital until her retirement. She was a quiet, unassuming, modest woman whom everyone loved for her boundless kindness and compassion. None of her many patients and colleagues ever suspected that this frail, gray-haired old woman had once been a fearless organizer in the most terrible place on earth, snatching medicine, food, and grains of hope from under the very nose of death. She took her great secret to her grave. Adam Nowak returned to Warsaw. He found no trace of his home, no trace of his past, happy life. He tried to return to science, even taught for a time at the rebuilt university. But he couldn't. The ghosts of Auschwitz haunted him every night. He couldn't forget the eyes of those he couldn't save. He couldn't forgive himself for the inhuman choice he had been forced to make. He tried several times to tell his story to journalists, to historians, but each time he met a wall of polite disbelief and bureaucratic indifference. His feat was too inconvenient. He was a hero who had used methods indistinguishable from those of a criminal. He was a savior who had willingly dirtied his hands. The world wanted simple, black and white stories of good and evil, and his story was written in agonizing, morally gray tones. In the end, he left science and took a job as an ordinary local doctor in a small town in Silesia. He treated children for colds and the elderly for rheumatism, and none of his patients ever suspected that their kind but always sad doctor was a man who had once organized a revolt in hell and deceived death itself. He was buried in the Old Town Cemetery on a rainy, gray autumn day. There were no grand speeches or military honors at his modest grave, but as the local old-timers told it, for many years after his death, someone unknown would bring not flowers to his grave, but a small, neat bundle of dried hogweed. Who it was and what it meant, no one knew. Official history, written in the quiet of offices and archives, has forgotten them. In the multi-volume foundational works on the Holocaust, in the thousands of pages of the Nuremberg trials transcripts, in the memoirs of survivors, you will not find a single word about the phantom epidemic in barrack number 17. There are no documents, no orders, no official testimonies that could confirm this incredible, audacious act of medical sabotage. The story of Dr. Nowak and his small team dissolved in time, becoming one of the many thousands of untold tragedies and unsung feats of Auschwitz. But what dies without a trace in dusty archives sometimes finds eternal, incorruptible immortality in legends. Among the few who survived the hell of Birkenau, a strange, almost mystical story was whispered for a long time. The story of an entire barrack that was suddenly struck by a mysterious, terrible disease similar to typhus, but from which, for some inexplicable reason, no one died. Some said it was a true miracle, a divine intervention that saved hundreds of lives from the gas chamber. Others, who knew a little more, spoke of a group of brave doctors who defied the SS system itself by staging a fake, man-made epidemic. This story was passed from mouth to mouth, from one survivor to another, acquiring new, fantastic details, turning into a true camp myth. In this legend, Dr. Nowak was not just a doctor, but almost a sorcerer who could control diseases with the power of his will. Sister Hannah was a saint who could procure anything from thin air. Emil Fischer was a grim, silent warrior with a scalpel in his hand. And Leo Grossman was a young, brilliant alchemist performing miracles in the gloomy morgue. Their feat, rejected and buried by official history, found its only but reliable refuge in popular memory, becoming an eternal symbol that even in the darkest, most hopeless place on earth, where all hope seemed to have died, human intellect, unyielding will, and a desperate love for life can achieve the impossible. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that a weapon can be not only steel, but also knowledge. That the most powerful and effective resistance can be quiet, invisible, and incomprehensible to the enemy. And that the greatest heroes are often those whose names have been forever erased from the pages of official history, but whose spirit lives on in legends, like an eternal, unquenchable flame that neither time nor oblivion can extinguish. They received no medals. Their names are not carved on granite memorials. But their true victory is the hundreds of lives saved, the children and grandchildren of those who were supposed to become black smoke on a cold January day in 1944. And perhaps that is the most important, the highest reward they could have ever dreamed of.